Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you all to the 16th EVPA policy webinar. Today's topic will be about social proofing, impact measurement, and InvestEU. My name is Bianca Polidoro. I'm the policy manager at EVPA, and I will be moderating the webinar. Before we dive into the topic of today's webinar, let me walk you through some technical aspects. Throughout this session, you will be able to open or hide the control panel, which is the console that appears on the right-hand side of your screen. Please note that the control panel automatically collapses when it's not being used, but you can keep it visible via the View menu on the top. In the Join Audio section of the control panel, you should tick the option Microphone and Speakers if you are joining the webinar through Internet. If you are using the telephone rather than the VoIP, you must choose Telephone and use the PIN code provided in the confirmation you received when you registered for this webinar. You can also see the PIN on this slide. If you happen to have any technical issues, please don't hesitate to call EVPA and get in touch with my colleague Gianluca Gaggiotti. You can find his contact details on this slide. Given the high level of participation in today's session, we have over 200 registered participants. We will be keeping the participants to the webinar muted in order to avoid noise interferences, but we really encourage you all to raise any question you might have. If you do have a question, please write it in the question section of the control panel at any point during the webinar. Please do not forget to clearly mention to whom you would like to address it. The last part of today's webinar will consist of an interactive Q&A session during which we will address your question to the panelists. If for some reason your question has not been answered during the webinar, feel free to contact us via email afterwards and we will ensure the necessary follow-up. You can also use that question section to let us know about any technical problems you experience. Last but not least, note that this session is being recorded, so you will be able to watch the recording and consult this presentation as of next week on EVPA website. Now that these housekeeping details are clear, let me give you a quick word about the European Venture Philanthropy Association. EVPA is a membership organization currently gathering more than 280 members from all across Europe that are interested in or are practicing venture philanthropy and social investment. Our members include foundations, social investors, academics, financial institutions, and service providers. Our policy and public affairs work relies on two pillars. First, in our role as thought leader, we act as a counterpart for the institutions of the EU by being the voice of the sector, communicating the concern and expectation of our members to European policymakers. Doing so, we lead the discussion and shape the debate. We also spot and discuss key topics of interest for our sector, including relevant initiatives undertaken by the EU. Second, in our role as a catalyst, we bring together different actors in conversation and collaboration in order to increase mutual understanding, shared value, and impact. We carry out initiatives that tap into the synergies between the public and the private sector and showcase best policy practices and inspirational success stories from our sector. We aim to inform, initiate interaction, and also inspire. Let me now speak about the policy webinar series. The Policy Webinar Series is a project we started in 2014 and through which we could reach more than 1,000 people. This series connects policymakers and practitioners in the venture, philanthropy, and social investment sector around topics of interest with the policy angle. As you can see, we have already addressed issues such as social impact bonds, public procurement, retail impact investing, or crowdfunding. If you are interested in these topics, all recordings and presentations are available on our website. At the end of the webinar, a short survey will pop up on your screen. We would greatly appreciate if you could take 2 minutes to fill this in. It is also an opportunity to let us know about a specific policy topic you would like us to address in our policy webinar series, so don't hesitate to grab it. Today's topic is social proofing, impact measurement, and InvestEU. And we will discuss that with two great speakers, Nicolas Costello, Deputy Head of Unit in the Directorate General of Employment of the European Commission, and Cyril Guffies, Investment Manager at the European Investment Fund and responsible for the management of EIF Social Impact Instruments portfolio. Let me introduce you the webinar's agenda. First of all, I will give you a short introduction. Then Nicolas Costello will explain you the concept of social sustainability proofing into the InvestEU framework. After Nicolas' explanation, Cyril Guffies will present the impact measurement from a practitioner point of view. At the end of these two presentations, we will have a Q&A session with the speakers. We will end this webinar with the EVPA conclusion. Now, before leaving the floor to our first speaker, I would like to explain what is the InvestEU Fund for those of you who are not yet familiar with it. InvestEU is one of the funds of the next EU budget, the multi-annual financial framework, which will be in place from 2021 to 2027. The InvestEU partial agreement has been reached last April, and the regulation adoption will be between November and December 2019. You will have more detailed information on InvestEU from Nicolas Costello today. And for any further curiosity, I also invite you to listen to a recording of the Hour 13 webinar on the EVPA website. What is important to highlight is that InvestEU will target investment in 4 different policy areas, also known as windows: sustainable infrastructure, research, innovation, digitalization, small and medium business, and social investment skills. In this webinar, we will focus on the social investment and skills window, which will finance projects, for instance, in skills, education, social housing, hospitals, social innovation, microfinance, social enterprises, integration of migrants and vulnerable people, and more. This webinar is a first step to understand which social-related projects can obtain the InvestEU fund and which criteria they should respect in order to achieve a positive social and societal impact. Today, we will try to understand together which social aspects of sustainability are considered into the InvestEU framework, thanks to the explanation of social sustainability proofing. Furthermore, we will hear how the European Commission aims to guarantee the achievement of these goals and what has been the previous experience on impact measurement from the European Investment Fund within a top-down and bottom-up perspective. We believe that the previous experience on impact measurement, such as the Social Impact Accelerator, SIA, could help the future implementation of InvestEU Fund. One of the goals of this webinar is to have a fruitful debate. Since this is a new topic, we need your opinions and suggestions to advance in the right direction. So please do not hesitate to ask questions. Now, please, Nicolas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bianca, and thanks for the invitation to take part in this, for me, the first webinar that I'm speaking at, so I hope I'll be able to master the technical aspects of it. So, as Bianca said, my aim is to explain the concept of social proofing and sustainability proofing. We've still got about 18 months till that concept has to turn into a reality that gets implemented, concrete investments. So we're at a stage of working together to see how it can really work. We've been given principles of what it's to achieve, which are in the partial agreement Bianca referred to. we say partial agreements, but in the normal course of events, that means that the text won't change because it's been agreed between the Commission, the Council and the Parliament, but the numbers will be added on later. That's slightly a simplification, but broadly true. So when I quote from the partial agreement, that's pretty much what will be in the regulation as it's adopted. So this slide shows what are the documents that make up and go towards the InvestEU package. But for me, the most important one is the top left one, the EFSI evaluation, the European Fund for Strategic Investments evaluation, because InvestEU is, again, slightly simplifying, it's the successor to the EFSI, also known as the Juncker Plan, but with some changes to it. One of the important ones being this introduction of sustainability proofing. The rest of this slide simply shows the documents, the other documents involved as annexes to the regulation. So one of the important changes is simplification, which also leads to making it more flexible. You can see in this slide, the slightly bigger box says FC, so this slide shows all of the previous programs which are brought together in InvestEU. By far the biggest one was FC. It's much bigger in terms of the allocations of funding than all the others. So bringing them all into one program clearly is a simplification, but it also allows flexibility because there can be movements between the different, what previously were separate programs, once they're all operating within one program. So the aim of InvestEU is to support some of the EU's policy objectives. The second one there, the sustainability of the Union economy and its growth, and the first one, competitiveness of the Union, are similar to the objectives of FC before, jobs and growth, or growth and jobs. Social resilience and inclusiveness of the Union is now given a strong emphasis in InvestEU, which is a novelty. And for completion, the integration of the capital markets is a remaining policy objective. So I'll be focusing on the third of these, on social resilience and inclusiveness, and how the regulation is going to be taking that into account. This shows that there are the 4 different windows, which Bianca mentioned, listed on the left, but also indicates their relative sizes. These figures may change a bit, will change a bit, but the rough proportions between them are likely to stay as they are here. So you can see that there's a specific window, you could call it the social window, social investment and skills, the 4th window, which is the smallest of the 4, but which will mobilize around 50 billion. It's likely to be more than that, actually, because the allocation's set to be increased, out of the total 650 billion to be mobilized. But that's a specific window. One of the points that especially the Parliament changed in reaching the partial agreement was that all 4 windows and all projects are to be subject to the social proofing, which I'm going to outline. So the partial agreement, there's one article of it if you ever get to look at it. For this topic, it's almost all in Article 7.3. And the text, it says that all of the operations above a certain size will be screened to see if they have an environmental, climate or social impact. And if they do, then they'll be subject to sustainability proofing. Sustainability proofing really means climate, environmental and social proofing altogether. Altogether, it's sustainability proofing. And it says the objective is to minimize detrimental impacts and maximize benefits on climate, environment and social dimension for projects above a certain size. Now, that will require some interpretation in practice because actually, I'd say it's rather loose wording. If you say that you're minimizing detrimental impacts rather than seeking not to have any excessive detrimental impacts, And it says you're maximizing benefits rather than seeking as many benefits as are practical. I say that because actually, if you want to minimize detrimental impacts, you wouldn't do a project. I mean, any project has some. I was walking over here, there are some probably good construction and reconstruction projects in the roads, but every one of them has detrimental impacts while it's being done. It makes it more difficult to cross the road and it's more messy. So every project, by definition, almost has some detrimental impacts. If you minimize them, you wouldn't do any projects. So that can't be taken literally. It must be taken with common sense to mean you're considering projects whose main objective is to achieve a rate of return as far as the investors are concerned. You want to make sure, firstly, that they aren't harmful in these three terms: climate change, environment, and socially. And secondly, that where possible, they have positive effects in these three different dimensions. That's the only reasonable interpretation of this phrasing. So, according to the text, we've seen that they apply to all the projects and all the windows for projects above a certain size. That's likely to cover the vast bulk of the projects. If we look at how EFSI worked, its predecessor, there, for example, of the hundreds of projects, I think there were only 7 that were below about 25 million. Which is in the range of the sort of threshold that could be considered. So essentially this means that all projects, except the very smallest, are likely to be subject to sustainability proofing. The screening is simply to see, is the first stage to see whether they have any impacts on these three dimensions. And if they don't have any significant impacts, then you don't need the full sustainability proofing. For those that do have an impact on at least one of those three dimensions, then the implementing partner, which means the organizations like institutions like the European Investment Bank or possible other financial institutions and intermediaries, that they're responsible for conducting this sustainability proofing. And to do that, they should follow guidance which the Commission has to provide, that's to say over the next 18 months, to check the compliance of the proposed operations. So there are several levels to this. That work of developing guidelines and guidance is something the Commission started to work on and is starting discussions on, will be producing as I say, over the next 18 months. And that'll be available and ready in time for operations to start. This is again a quotation from the draft regulation. You'll see that the first two concern more the climate change and environment, and the third of these is the one that is about social impact. So far, I've presented them as if there's a symmetry between the three different dimensions. There are also important differences in this sense. I'd say that as you move from climate to environment to social, in a way it becomes more and more complex. You could say that for climate, at least for adaptation, for trying to achieve not more than 1.5 degrees or whatever the target is, there's one single metric. You can actually measure the impact of each project and they're directly comparable. That simplifies the task of seeing what's the climate impact of a project. For social impact, that's clearly not the case. If you look just at the text of the third indent there, the bottom indent, it mentions gender equality, it mentions social inclusion of areas or populations, it mentions the economic development of areas affected by structural challenges. Those are clearly very different impacts. Different people will have different judgments as to which are more important, and there's no objective truth to that. There may be a social consensus about it, and that consensus may change over time. So you can see that estimating the social impact is much more complicated than estimating the immediate climate impact. the others would fall somewhere in the middle, the environmental impact. I mean, obviously, I don't know, biodiversity and the pollution effects on human health and so on are all environmental impacts, but different people would give different relative importances, so that's subject to some of the same complications as measuring social impact. So those are some of the conceptual challenges that we're facing as we work towards developing this guidance. What we're doing practically at the moment, we're at the very early stages. We've been discussing within the Commission and a bit with the European Investment Bank. We're drawing on, there are some sources of previous experience. For example, the European Investment Bank has guidelines on environmental and social concerns, which is one source we can look at. Less within the EU, but more in developing countries, the EU has experience of social impact assessments for development projects, and that also gives some ideas of what factors to take into account. So we're looking at all the possible sources of knowledge and practice to work towards developing this guidance. This slide mentions the principle of sustainable development, and I there also mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, which all of the member states in the European Union have committed to as part of the United Nations, which are a further source of guidance and ideas for what should be taken into account in measuring the in sustainability proofing and social proofing. Then I'd also want to situate this social proofing and sustainability proofing in a wider policy context. It's not simply a matter of InvestEU. There are a whole range, it's a general tendency in EU policy at the moment to take more account of these issues, climate issues, broader environmental issues and social issues in a range of different policy areas. Firstly, it's not just for InvestEU, but it's for the structural funds in general. All the new regulations have similar considerations that these dimensions need to be taken into account. And in other policy areas, for example, if there's a policy on sustainable finance proposed, which again is to facilitate things like green bonds and social bonds, or sustainability bonds, which would be a combination of the two. And in that area, again, it's more advanced on the climate change and environmental side than on the social side, so that the taxonomies that are being developed for green bonds are more advanced, and the idea is to follow a year or two later with a similar taxonomy for social bonds, therefore allowing sustainability bonds that could combine both of those. So those are some of the main considerations that we're going to need to take into account. And here's a map of the period during which we'll need to take them into account. The first three are already in the past and have been mentioned already. Towards the end of the year, with the multi-annual financial framework agreement and then the adoption of the regulation, we'll actually have the final numbers of the allocations of funding to these different windows. And then there's just over a year until the entry into force, which is the period during which what I've just been talking about will need to be finalized. So I hope that gives some information, and I'm looking forward to the discussion about it later.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicholas, firstly for this detailed review on social sustainability proofing and InvestEU. I would like to remind the audience that you already have the possibility to write your questions, so please don't hesitate to write questions. And now, please, Cyril, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bianca. Thank you, Nicola, for the presentation. So I'm pleased to be with you this afternoon, and pleased to be invited to speak at the webinar. Thank you for putting it together. I'll focus the presentation, as far as I'm concerned, on measurement methodology, so falling under the overriding topic of impact measurement, obviously. And to put things into perspective, so I'm working for the European Investment Fund, and the European Investment Fund is part of the European Investment Bank group. So as alluded to in the previous presentation, the EIB is obviously also part. And as we speak, deep in negotiations with the European Commission to mobilize, structure the InvestEU program for the next 7 years. And here, the focus will be on an existing facility that we are currently managing at EIF, which is the Social Impact Accelerator, as you can see on the slide right now. The general or the common approach to all our intervention at EIF on the European market is that we are wholesaler. So that means we are not investing directly in projects, companies, micro enterprises, impact companies. But we are backing or financially supporting intermediaries. So what you are looking at now is a chart representing EIF's intervention on the social impact space, the Social Impact Accelerator. So this fund is a public-private partnership, even though massively contributed by the EIB. Of 243 million euros, we have 4 investors external to the group, to the EIB group: Crédit Coopératif, Deutsche Bank, Citra, Bulgarian Development Bank. This fund of funds was raised in 2013. So self-implied is the fact that we are, as June 2019, so currently reaching the end of our investment period. We have by the end of the month, we'll have invested 220 million in 19 impact funds. So that's the way we operate. And now you'll see on the next slide that we are also working with just a few words before jumping into the impact measurement topic, that we are obviously using a social SME impact company definition that is worth mentioning before jumping into the topic. So we are investing across the European Union, so that means across 28 member states, 28 very different markets, in some cases with lots of common points. So we need to have a pragmatic definition of what an impact company is, and I would frame it as three main features. First, intentionality. The impact generated at the level of the company has to be intentional. It is by no means some type of positive externality out of the business model, but rather achieving positive social impact is at the heart of the business model and at the heart of the entrepreneur's ethos, I would say. Second, the scalability. We are in a model, in this case, the fund of fund impact investing, which is close to the venture capital model. So that means ultimately entrepreneurs are being invested by impact funds because there is a potential to scale, if possibly, and possibly large scale development of the innovation of the solution. And third, that's really also fundamental to across our impact investing strategy, the positive correlation that has to exist between impact, social impact, and financial performance. We are trying to avoid the often referred to debate on impact first or finance first, by rather taking the view that there is a positive correlation between impact and financial performance, and that both of them actually nurture the other. Since there is obviously, it's always often a debated, perhaps even heated debate around what is and is not impact, we take the view that because there will always be, and that's perhaps my view, there will never be a common consensus around what impact is. That makes the measurement very important, because that's again a very pragmatic way of being able to show or to demonstrate almost in a scientific way the impact or the non-financial outcome of an enterprise, a company, of an activity. Because again, we are a fund of funds active across EU, we also have a duty to make this definition, to make this impact measurement implementable, if I may say. I'm not sure it's English, by the way, but let's coming up with a model that we can implement, or an impact measurement that we can implement. And we are qualifying impact companies in these three different buckets that you see. First, let's say bullseye, if I may say, social business model. So really a model whereby the social innovation or the resolution of a identified social issue is in the heart of the company's business model. For instance, a company using technology to make education affordable. That would be a typical example. Using technology to make also healthcare work in a more efficient way, especially when it comes to, for instance, aging population. So make sure that you can, with some technological device, bring closer dependent people to their relatives and family, rather than, let's say, having them in some type of elderly care. Second, traditional business models run in a social way. So here it could be, to be very extreme and illustrative, pizza delivery company, but the way, so this has nothing to do with the social business, but the way the model is run generates a social impact. And third, the so-called geographically focused business model. So a company, because it is active either, for instance, suburbs of a large city that accumulates a lot of economic and social and perhaps even cultural discrimination, like creating a company in that area has a very strong signaling effect. It's a very powerful tool to create jobs in a community that is often remote from the labor market. So this would be the three ways we look at impact, and these three type of business models for us would qualify as an impact model. Now, next slide, please, Bianca, is, thank you very much. Going now deeper into what do we mean by impact measurement and what's at stake. So three boxes here. And again, this is something that we agree on with the fund manager here, the GP for general partner. So the GP refers to fund manager. The fund manager agrees and is required in the regulation of the fund to define at least 1 and up to 5 impact indicators per portfolio company. Second, 1 unique quantifiable target per indicator at the moment of the investment. So for instance, 1 indicator would be number of jobs created for handicapped people, for instance, and the quantifiable target would be 2,000. And then for each indicators, a weighting can be allocated, let's say, to an indicator to reflect as close as possible the business model. Here, the idea is that we rather insist on a methodology than on a list of predefined indicators that are often artificial. What prevails here is that the definition of an impact indicator has to be as close as possible to the business model, so that it is first easy to measure, and second, strong in terms of data it provides, rather than something that is already from the outset an indicator that is remote from, or too remote from, the business model. Second, we are asking the entrepreneur and the investor to find an agreement around what type of indicator, how many indicator, and a quantifiable target for each of these indicators. Obviously, the investors in the fund, such as ourselves, have also the opportunity to validate those targets and indicators. And that's something that we would do at the advisory committee level. So we would, as advisory committee member, approve indicators, approve target, or contrary, like question the validity of an indicator or the target and ask the fund manager to make a new proposal if we feel the indicator is not relevant or that the target is too low. And finally, that means once a year, we're asking our fund managers to report on those indicators at company level and at portfolio level. So on the next slide, you'll see an example of how does a portfolio impact multiple may look over time. So you have here 12 companies randomly or randomized, let's say, with in the column next to it an indicator multiple. What do we mean by indicator multiple? This is basically purely and simply the division between the realized value in a given year and the target. So to quote my example I was referring to earlier around number of jobs created for handicapped people, that would be the indicator. The target would be 2,000. And here in this case, let's say in the first year, 400 jobs are created for handicapped people. So the indicator multiple would be 0.2. Then you see that we are getting to one single company impact multiple, which is the result of the average between the three indicators in the case of company one. Company one, company impact multiple is 0.23. So we're doing this same exercise, same way, taking into account the weighting for all companies of the portfolio. And then to get to a portfolio impact multiple, we are weighting those company impact multiples by the capital that is invested in the company. So this way, we also take a portfolio approach whereby, same as venture capital model or financial model, one company doing particularly good on the impact could make up for a company that performs less on that topic. What prevails is really the portfolio impact multiple on an aggregated basis. And if you see on the next slide, which is the final one, if I'm not mistaken, that's also a very important point of this presentation. The company or the portfolio impact multiple, the way it performs has a consequence on the carried interest. So as much as in a regular financial setup or let's say common venture capital setup, you would, the investor have the possibility to get a share of the profits if the fund performs well from a financial point of view. In our impact space, this eligibility or entitlement of the investors to get a share of the profit is subject first, yes, to financial performance, but second, also to impact objective being met. So this way we make sure there is let's say an alignment of interest between the investors in the fund, the entrepreneurs and the investors in the company around creating a positive social impact. So, sorry, this mechanism works obviously and becomes relevant only when the fund has generated a financial performance. No financial incentive or no profit share can be distributed to the investor if there is no financial profit that has been created or financial value that has been created. That also means that with this system, you have 3 steps whereby if you are performing below a certain threshold, in this case 0.6% or 0.6 or 60%, then there is no carry distributed to the team. And in this case, the investors would not get the carried interest, but it would be, let's say, distributed to foundation, NGO, incubator of the suggested by the fund manager. 0.6 and 0.8, 50% goes to the fund manager, 60% goes to 50% goes to a foundation. And if the overall social portfolio impact multiple is above 80% or 0.8, then 100% of the carry is distributed to the fund manager. So that, in a nutshell, in a 20-minute presentation, what I wanted to share with you around EIF impact measurement methodology. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Cyril. And actually now we can start the Q&A section, and we have many questions from the audience, and I would like to address my first question to Nicolas. Is there a plan to have a social taxonomy?
Yes, this is a question, I understand it, about sustainable finance.
Yeah.
Plan is a strong word. There's a stated intention to. There's the current documents say that a taxonomy is being developed, and there are drafts already in existence as far as environment is concerned. And they also say that the intention is to develop a social taxonomy as a second stage, because work is less advanced on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, the second question is for Cyril. How can there be consensus on impact measurement if there is no consensus yet on what impact is?
Yeah, good point. Actually, that's again being very pragmatic around how to come about the issue. Is that obviously these are two parallel efforts that need to be done. We are also very active in presenting as much as we can, and this is also part of the reason why I'm grateful being invited to speak at this webinar. We are obviously sharing to the widest possible extent our vision and our understanding of what impact is or should be. Obviously, bearing in mind that this is a very long debate around a variety of stakeholders, we are also in parallel putting implementing or putting into motion, let's say, our vision of impact through this impact measurement framework or methodology. Disclaimer on this, because also even internally, this is also a debate, and I'm sharing here my views. But the thing is that there is still a very strong theoretical approach behind impact around the theory of change, the so-called theory of change, whereby, and that's the backbone of our reasoning, whereby you have an arrow that describes the activity of a company, a project, an infrastructure, where you have input generating output, itself generating outcome and impact. So that's the theory of change that is again the backbone of our impact definition. And let's say the chemically pure definition of impact is the positive change induced by an activity discounted from what would have happened anyhow. Again, that's the chemically pure definition of impact, let's say, and I think many stakeholders agree on this. But then when it comes to translating this into real world and real life, that's a different story. Because from this point of view, I was quoting the example of number of handicapped jobs created. One could argue whether this is a chemically pure definition of impact. However, that's a satisfactory enough compass to assess the quality of the impact generated by a company.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we have another question for Nicolas. Could you please explain the difference between social sustainability proofing and impact measurement? How do you distinguish the two?
Yes, for this, for social sustainability proofing, I'm clear. For impact measurement, that's something I've come across again in terms of that theory of change that Cyril just mentioned, in terms of the discussion around social outcome contracting and social impact bonds. So I'd first like to check if that's the correct context in which to talk about impact measurement from the point of view of the question. I don't know if that's feasible the way this webinar works, or if I should just take a guess and see. Okay. I mean, the whole discussion about impact, well, the continuum that Gio just mentioned, input, output, outcome, impact, is, as he says, over time. And when you're judging a project and its effects, there's a trade-off between judging the effects which happen very quickly, which is easiest to measure in a timely way. That would be especially outcomes, or even inputs, actually. I'll give concrete examples to make clearer what I mean in a moment. Or judging what you really care about, which is the impact, and the outcomes would be closer to that. What I mean is, if you want to achieve an objective, like say, we were taking the example of jobs for people with disabilities. You could, in a classical kind of service provision, you would hire people to give some training. They might give some training courses to companies of how to do this and how to incorporate people with disabilities in their work. That would then lead to the hiring of some number of people with disabilities, and the long-term impact would include not just whether they're hired, but whether they keep those jobs and whether they've still got them 5 years or 10 years later. So in that continuum, what you really care about is people with disabilities being hired and keeping those jobs and it all working out well for them. That you will only know for certain in 5 or 10 or 15 years' time. So if you want to reward people for doing what you want them to do, the simplest thing is to reward inputs. You just pay people for doing the job. You could go a bit better by rewarding outputs, which is the number of training courses given. You pay according to that. You could go further and reward outcomes like the number of people with disabilities who are hired, but that might be over 2 years later or 3 years later, and you'd need a different kind of financial machinery in order to make that possible, because you're only going to pay people for things 3 years after they start doing things. So obviously they have to have the money to do the things during those 3 years. That's where, for instance, social impact bonds come in and other forms of social outcome contracting. Or ideally, in terms of the results you want, you would reward for impacts, which might be even longer than 3 years. It might be 5 or 10 years later, and then the financial machinery needs to be even more complex. Those are one way. That, to me, measurement of impact is in order to allow the activities to be designed to achieve what you really want to achieve, which is impact as much as possible. That the particular mechanisms that I mentioned, like social impact bonds and other forms of social outcome contracting, are one way to achieve that. There are lots of different forms of investment in which you pay for those different stages, and they have advantages and disadvantages. There've been a lot of experiments recently on social impact bonds, for instance. I would say there's some positive indications where the jury seems to be out on them. But if I'm understanding the question right, the impact measurement is for one particular kind of way of organizing projects whose aim is always to achieve impact. But whether you achieve that by rewarding impact, by rewarding outcome, or rewarding outputs, or even paying for inputs, is a practical, empirical question, if you like.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for this really clear explanation. And actually, there is another good question for Cyril. Do you think that the IF's approach to impact measurement could be applied to the social sustainability proofing within InvestEU?
Yeah, I think that's obviously, I don't want to preempt the discussion that are currently going on, but it's fair to say that it's a relevant framework to measure that is also of interest for the European Commission. To be clear, and as you may have seen from the presentation, the European Commission is not an investor directly in the SIA, but it's certainly very active on impact. I confine my presentation to this fund of fund, but also the European Commission is putting at work a lot of capital to back social impact bond, accelerator, incubator, and a variety of intermediaries that are focusing on impact investing. And it's fair to say that already as we speak, in a number of those initiatives that falls under the so-called FC program that Nicolas described earlier in his presentation, already use this impact measurement methodology. So it's not, sometimes it's complemented by other methodologies, but definitely I think it's fair to say that it's let's say this impact measurement framework nurtures very much the discussion between the EIB group and the European Commission on how impact could be measured also in the future looking forward.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we have another question from the audience for Nicolas. What dimensions will social proofing cover? Do we already know?
Again, a good question. We don't know yet. We've got ideas, we're exchanging them and debating them. We're actually looking forward to the work on the social taxonomy and hoping that it comes out in time to be useful as an input for the guidance which the Commission has to develop and which over the next 18 months. We're also planning to organize a study to bring in expertise, and I mentioned a list of possible sources of ideas. There are certainly other good and possible sources which we haven't thought of or don't know of. So we want to bring in experts on the area to contribute to developing this sort of list of issues which should be covered. One of the important inputs to that, which I should have mentioned, is the European Pillar of Social Rights, because that is European Union's guidance already on what are the key areas of social concern. So we're already started going through that as a kind of checklist to make sure that we consider all of those as important points of social impact.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, there are two questions for Cyril regarding the SIA. So the first one is, do you require the GPs to measure the quality of impacts in the portfolio companies? For example, not just the number of jobs created, but the types and quality of those jobs, like average pay rates, etc. And also connected to this, what is the average holding period of portfolio investment by GPs? So over what period of time are the impact indicators measured, basically? Just clarifying for the audience.
Yeah, good question. So as I mentioned, and I cannot stress this point enough, what we are agreeing with the GP we invested is a methodology. So that means, yes, we very much welcome GPs to measure or encourage GPs to measure the quality of the impact generated. One indicator that we often find in our in the funds we're invested in, for instance, would be next to a volume indicator, for instance, number of jobs. Another indicator, and that's why there can be up to 5 indicators per company, is either through survey, like satisfaction of those people being employed around how they would self-assess the quality of the job they have, but also, for instance, and as you mentioned, like the type of contract. Is it a permanent contract? Is it a fixed-term contract? So definitely within the indicator that themselves have a quantifiable target, you find qualitative indicators. For instance, if we have percentage of people claiming or asserting that they are that their life have, or their professional life or prospects have improved with this job, we would have a target at never less than 75%. And if the company fails to deliver at least 75% satisfaction on the job they generate, then they would not meet that target, or that target. First question. And second question, if I recall correctly, was around the holding period. So that again has to do with the let's say the features of our investment. The vast majority of the funds we invest in are 10 years lifetime fund. So and they would invest in the first 5 years. That would be the investment period, and try to exit their investment in the following 5 years. So that means you deduct the average holding period would be around 7 years, I would say. Some last as little or as short as 2 years holding period. Some others would stay investors for 10 years. It depends.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question for Nicolas. Will the implementing partners need to report on the achievement or not of the expected impact?
The implementing partners do have to report on the overall results. A decision, firstly, of whether to fund a project, to guarantee a project, is taken by the investment committee, and that the investment committee is supplied with lots of different kinds of information, including a scoreboard about the general viability of the project and the results of the sustainability proofing where that's needed. So, and that's prepared by the implementing partners. So there, for all of the projects that have a sustainability impact, the implementing partners have to report on the impact, on the sustainability impact that the project can be foreseen to have. There are general reporting requirements as the project goes on, but for the sustainability proofing, that's something at the start of the project, rather than ongoing once implementation is started.
Ex ante.
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
This is really useful to know. Thank you very much. Now we have another question for Cyril. Is the supply of social enterprises high enough to meet the capital supply?
Can you repeat, Bianca, please?
Yeah, is the supply of social enterprises high enough to meet the capital supply?
Yes, well, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, yeah, I cannot give as much of a blunt answer as yes. Two things. I mean, there is a massive trend in the market that is observable and confirmed by all stakeholders, from entrepreneurs to investors to fund of fund investors, that when perhaps, and again, to be slightly caricatural, but I think, I mean, the trend is true and confirmed. When 10 years, 15 years ago, out of 100 students going out of the best, let's say, universities, MBAs, only perhaps 10% would wish to become entrepreneurs. Nowadays, the proportion is clearly out of 100 students going out of university, 20 to 25% want to become entrepreneurs, so much more. And the interesting bit is that out of these students that want to be an entrepreneur or that are already working on setting up a company, more than half of these would have the objective to set up a company that solves environmental or social problems, and not only have the ambition to create a company that will grow and go very high in valuation. There is always the will to let's say create a company that solves the world most pressing problem. So let's say that the match between supply and demand is definitely, in my view, much. I mean, this sector would deserve even more financial support, and that's why all the stakeholders like the European Commission and a variety of stakeholders are actually supporting segments. And I mean, the amounts that are at stake are still fundamental to steer the development of the market and are bound to grow in the future. That's confirmed by all kinds of surveys and research.
Okay, thank you. Actually, we have another question for you. What happens with impact measurement if the startups is tech-based and it takes time to obtain social impact?
Well, the most of the companies that we are indirectly backing are tech-based, are technological digital companies. But then let me give you a few examples, and that was also the companies I mentioned in the presentation. A company like Open Classrooms does a fully online certification and provides full online diploma that is recognized by the French state and Ministry of Education. And this is like close to more than 1/3 of people following courses on this platform are unemployed. And another large third of the users of this course are people that are in a career shift, let's say, that are getting to or training or seeking to get a training on another sector than the one they are currently active on, to increase their chance to get a job or increase their satisfaction in their professional life. And this is, they have very impressive ratios whereby close to 80% of the users of this platform, of the people receiving a diploma from Open Classroom, find a job. So technology actually, in my view, rather accelerates the impact. It accelerates the impact rather than implies long duration before the impact is generated.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question for Nicolas this time. Will projects with no or low positive social impact be excluded from the funding? Does this depend on the window to which they belong?
Mm-hmm. Thanks. A project doesn't have to have a positive social impact. I mean, outside the social window, for the bulk of the funding and the three other windows, the projects, as mentioned, would be projects that will achieve a decent rate of return, and that's what will interest investors in investing in it. The two considerations are that it shouldn't have a bad social impact, and that where possible, it should have a positive social impact. So our understanding so far in the discussions of how to interpret that, the aspect of not having a bad social impact is the easier one, because you simply see if there's significant bad social impact, then the project doesn't get supported. But then how do you take into account the positive social impact, which some projects will have and others won't have? Well, the phrasing in the draft regulation, as I mentioned, talks about maximizing the positive social impact. And I also mentioned the difficulty of that, because if you maximize it, then to maximize it, you would make that the only consideration in deciding whether to accept the project or not. You would accept the project that has the highest social impact, and whether or not it provides a decent rate of return to the investor, or whether or not anything else. So if you're maximizing something, you don't take anything else into account, logically. So what my understanding of what that's likely to be interpreted to mean is that you maximize the social impact given all the other constraints and considerations that have to be taken into account. So therefore, one way to do that would be to say that if you have two projects which are broadly similar in other respects, score the same on the scoreboard about how financially viable they are and so on, you would choose the one with the better social impact. So therefore, it doesn't have to have a positive social impact, but if it has a positive, it mustn't have a negative social impact. And if it does have more of a positive social impact, it's more likely to get the funding and the support from the investment committee.
Okay, thank you very much.
There is one more question for Cyril. What is the typical financial performance hurdle rate in the fund's sponsor in relation to the financial carry? And I'm also going to ask you another question is it correct to state that the portfolio impact multiple must be calculated at the end of the funds, or is it when there is an exit of the investee?
Yeah, good question. So first of all, there is a very wide variety of hurdle rates for impact funds, as much as there is a variety of financial performance targets. To quote and to give a very concrete example out of our current portfolio, the CR, we have funds that have a hurdle rate that starts around 2%, and there are some reasons for that, and up to 8%. And also fair to say that we have very different risk profiles depending on the market where we are and depending on the type of strategy that is put together. So there's some funds are seeking to achieve some between 3 to 5 IRR, net IRR, and some seek to generate 20% IRR. And that has to do with the, let's say, sophistication of the investment strategy, the sophistication of the market, of the ecosystem they are active on. But we see a very wide variety. Some compete definitely with traditional venture capital funds, and some are, let's say, have less ambitious targets in terms of financial performance, but certainly as ambitious in terms of impact. And then it is up to us to make this decision in also looking at our mandate, which is about developing the overall market across the EU, take more risk in certain markets and be more selective in some others. So that was on the first question. On the second question, it's on the second question, we indeed with the impact measurement methodology we're using, the carry can be distributed towards the end of the fund lifetime, but not necessarily when all the companies are exited. We can, if the fund performs well, distribute carry before all companies are exited or realized out of the portfolio. So that's the link with the carry distribution. Now again, we ask each and every fund to report once a year, so that even starting year one on their portfolio impact multiple, company impact multiple.
Okay, thank you very much. We can finish this session, and I would like to thank both of you, Nicolas and Cyril, for your speeches and for this interesting exchange of knowledge. Now, on one hand, we have a clear vision of what social sustainability proofing means into the InvestEU framework and how it could help the project which aim to achieve positive social and societal impact to obtain InvestEU funding. On the other hand, we hear the EIF's approach on how to measure the impact in order to achieve positive outcomes. And moreover, we hear that the EIF's approach might help the screening of the social-related projects which aim to get InvestEU funding. I would like to conclude this webinar hoping that the social sustainability proofing will help a proper allocation of InvestEU funds and will increase investment in social impact ecosystem in order to reach as much as social impact as possible. We would like to achieve this goal involving different stakeholders which are experts in this field. So please, if you have comments, advice, or suggestions, do not hesitate to contact EVPA. Also, I would like to thank all our participants today and to remind you that a recording of this webinar together with the slides will be available on our website soon. In addition, I would kindly remind you that a short survey will pop up on your screen. We would greatly appreciate if you could take 2 minutes to fill this in. It is also an opportunity to let us know about a specific policy topic you would like to address in our policy webinar series. So don't hesitate to grab it. Thank you for attending this webinar and have a nice evening.
Thank you very much, Bianca. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.